A lot of people's car knowledge was passed down from an older generation, who got it from an older generation, who learned it working on a car that looked like this. Replacing your brake lines is pretty straightforward once you get past all the bad information. Technology has changed, thankfully. Running all new brake lines is fairly inexpensive, reasonably easy, and much safer than it used to be. Heads up, right at the beginning, you will forget to put a nut on a brake line before you flare it. Happens to everybody at least once on every car by law, so be prepared. The basic layout of your brake lines should be familiar if you've spent any time under a hood. You have two outlets from your master cylinder. One goes to the front brakes, usually the one in the front, and one goes to the rear brakes. There are two outlets so that there are two completely separate systems in the case of failure. Usually the reservoir will also have a split partway down to keep the two fluid systems totally separate in case one leaks. From the master cylinder, you'll want to run hard lines to the front and back. Then you'll have a T-fitting that splits each line off into left and right. From there, you'll have more hard lines that go to the corners where you'll have a hard mount to the frame. At that mount, the line changes to flexible lines that go out to your calipers. If you have a solid axle, the flexible section will be between the body and the axle, and then you'll have a T and hard lines to the corners. You'll often also see flexible lines at the corners because a lot of calipers are floating or sliding and they need some movement. You might also have a couple of other things. If you're running drum brakes, you might have a residual pressure valve. You might also have a proportioning valve. A proportioning valve is needed whenever you might have too much rear brake. You don't want your rear brakes to lock up before your front brakes, otherwise your back end might slide around and you could spin out. I don't think that will be a problem on my car, but I'm going to put a valve in anyway. This way I can crank the rear brakes all the way down and do sick burnouts. The type of line you use, both hard and soft, is important. Brake lines run at very high pressures and they're exposed to water and salt. They're also safety critical. I know you have some copper line left over from when you plumbed that water line to your new fridge, but don't use that. There are basically three types of hard brake lines that you can use: steel, stainless steel, and nickel copper. Sometimes on old cars or dodgy race car projects, you'll see copper, aluminum, or nylon, and you'll sometimes hear people say that these work fine. I've had copper brake lines on my Camaro since '85. This is called survivorship bias. You don't hear about the failures because those people are dead. Anyway, steel, stainless steel, and NiCop. Steel needs to be coated, usually zinc, tin, or a plastic coating. I have coated steel lines on my S600 and they're holding up just fine. Stainless lines look better, so if you're doing some kind of show car with shiny things everywhere, you'll want to get stainless. I don't like stainless brake lines because they're much more expensive, they're harder to bend and harder to flare, although the tools I'm going to go over will bend and flare these just fine. I use nickel copper brake lines, sometimes called NiCop. It is copper tubing, but unlike that stuff you used for your water cooler, it's alloyed with about 10% nickel, which gives it the strength of steel lines and the bendability of copper and excellent corrosion resistance. This is probably the stuff you want. The advantage of this line, its bendability, is also kind of its disadvantage. You have to clip it down in several spots so that it doesn't get knocked around and bent when you're messing around in the frunk of your old Jag. This is actually a good idea anyway, even with more rigid line. You don't want your hard line to be moving around and chafing while you're driving and wear through. It's also hard to get this line straight. It kind of always has some little bumpy bends in it. You can buy a straightener or make one. Some people have suggested drilling a hole the size of your brake line in a 2x4 and pulling it through. Other suggestions are to roll it between a couple sheets of plywood. Me, I don't really care. Some people prefer straight, but it's totally fine if you're not straight. Hashtag Pride Month. As for size, you probably want to use 3/16 of an inch or 4.75 millimeters for those of you that don't live in the States and are always getting on my case about not using metric. These are the same size tube, they're interchangeable. This is great for me because I'm mixing metric and imperial with the Tesla master cylinder and rear brakes and the Willwood front brakes and proportioning valve. If you have ABS or you're replacing a line that was a different size, you might want to verify the size and use what was originally intended, but 3/16 is great if you don't have any reason not to use 3/16. They sell brake lines in rolls of 25 feet, which is a good start. My Jag took 27 feet, which was a little frustrating. For the flexible sections of your lines, you probably just want to buy pre-made lines that are the right length. I've made flexible lines before by getting some AN line and putting my own ends on it. It works, in fact it's on my Honda right now, but I would recommend buying pre-made lines. Be sure to get ones that are specifically made for brakes. A lot of these lines are made for oil or fuel and they won't hold up to the pressure of brake lines. A lot of people like to plan out their brake lines before bending them using something like a stiff wire. I've seen people use wire hangers. I just sort of bend it on the car as I go. If you're using stainless or steel, you probably want to plan it out a little more, but with the nickel copper, you can bend it by hand to get it moved around in the right spot. When I say you can bend it by hand, I mean you can bend it a little. If you try to get more than a few degrees out of it, you will kink it and you'll have to throw it away and start over. For the big bends, you'll want a bender. Make sure you get one for 3/16. There are a lot of benders out there sold as brake tube benders that only go down to 1/4 inch. This one is great for 1/4, 5/16, and 3/8, but it's not very good for 3/16. This thing says it will bend 3/16, but it says to just use the 1/4 inch die, and that crushes the lines a little bit more than I would prefer. So for the 3/16 inch lines, I bought this guy, which is great. Highly recommended. It gets a nice clean bend and a really tight radius. They also sell these spring things that you slide over the tube. I wouldn't use these. When you run your brake lines, it's good to not have any local high spots. You can usually pull air bubbles all the way through with a vacuum bleeder, but if your line goes way up and then way back down, there's a chance that you'll get air bubbles stuck in there. Then you'll always have a spongy brake pedal, or worse, not enough brake power to stop. Sometimes you'll see these loops in the lines near the master cylinder. Some people will tell you that they are service loops so you can change out parts easily. Some people will say that they're for relative movement between the body and the frame. And some people put them there because they bought lines that were too long and needed to take up some slack. I don't use them, but it is good to note that on a body-on-frame vehicle that has rubber isolators, like mine, you will have relative movement between the body and the frame. So you do need to have some length between the body mount and the frame mount for a bit of movement. When you're cutting a brake line, you need to maintain its roundness so that you can still slip on the nut and use the flaring tool. The best way to do this is to use a tube cutting tool. This is my tubing cutter. It has a huge capacity. You could cut a guy's arm off with this thing. It's a bit overkill for 3/16 nickel copper. So for these, I use this little guy here. This one's great because you can actually use it in the car while you're running the brake lines. To use these, you turn the little knob to push the little blade up against the tube, make it snug, and then rotate it around the tube once or twice. Then tighten the knob a little more and spin it around again. Do this until your brake line becomes 2 brake lines. After you're done cutting it, it is important to deburr the end of the tube. You need a clean end without any flanges. There are tools specifically made for brake lines, but I just use my deburring tool. There are only 2 acceptable flares to use on brake lines, the double flare and the bubble flare. Double flares are sometimes called inverted flares and sometimes called SAE flares. I will be calling them SAE inverted double flares so that there is no confusion. Bubble flares are sometimes called DIN flares or ISO flares. I will just be calling them bubble flares. This is a German standard, and by the way, Germans should be in charge of all standards. Any standard that has an overlap between an existing DIN standard should be removed in favor of that standard. German standards are, I don't want to use the word superior. We'll just say the Germans are good at making standards. Also schnitzel. Do not use single flares on brake lines. They're fine on oil and coolant lines and fuel as long as you're not using high pressure direct injection, but they are not good for brake lines. They're not approved by anybody who knows anything about brakes, and frankly, they're lazy. Just do a double flare. And don't use any fittings that are not specifically made for brake lines, like compression fittings. If you use compression fittings on your brake lines, I will come to your house while you're sleeping and punch you in the I am admittedly a pretty cheap guy, but there are a few places where I tend not to skip. Tools is one of them. I really like tools, and I like to not buy tools more than once. Another area where I don't shy away from spending money is brakes. Brakes are great because they're not only safety systems, they're also performance systems. If you're trying to go fast around a racetrack, you need really great brakes. It took a while for some people to figure this out. I used to own a Dodge Viper, a 2002 GTS ACR. ACR stands for American Club Racing. It was set up supposedly from the factory as a race car. It had racing shocks that had to be rebuilt frequently, a 5-point harness, but the brakes were total garbage. The rear brakes were literally carryovers from a Mitsubishi Eclipse. I have bigger calipers on my Grom. Anyway, brakes are great, tools are great, and tools to make brakes, that's definitely worth spending a little bit of money on. There was also a time in my auto building career where I had no money. I built and fixed many vehicles with Harbor Freight and swap meet tools, so I respect that some people will be doing it this way, but I still recommend that you spend some money on a good flaring tool. You can sometimes get a good flare with these, but they suck to use. More importantly, you'll often get shitty flares, and it's really frustrating when you've bent and ran a tube and you get one good flare on one side and one shitty flare on another side and you have to throw the whole thing away. You probably want something like this. It is 10 times more expensive than the cheaper one, but if you're not willing to spend money on this, I recommend you try to find lines that are already flared. Auto parts stores will sell you straight lengths of brake lines that are already flared with the nuts on them. You can get several different lengths, and you can use unions to connect these sections together. This is my flaring tool and it's great for a few reasons. First, it's easy to use, plenty of leverage. You can also use it for any type of brake line, including stainless. The dies get a great grip, you won't have the lines slipping out the back. This one does all the flares, 3/16, quarter, 5/16, 3/8 in single, double, or bubble flares. You can also get an additional set of dies that will let you do 37-degree flares that are used on AN fittings and JIC fittings. These are great for fuel lines, oil lines, some coolant lines. You need a bench vise to use it, but you kind of need one for most of the other flaring tools too, and you should definitely have a good bench vise if you're doing any kind of serious wrenching. Okay, are you ready for your first flare? Are you sure? Did you forget something? Yes, you forgot to put the nut that goes on the line. You have to put the nut on the line before you flare. This is less important for the first flare since you can slide it on from the other side unless you've already bent it. Actually, there are a couple of things you need to do before you flare. The first is to make sure you deburr your brake line after you cut it. You need a nice clean end without any flashing. You also need to put a little bit of lubrication on the pointy part of your flaring tool that creates the flare. This will help get a better flare. I just use a drop of brake fluid. Now grab your dies. You should have one for each size of tube. We'll be using 3/16 inch. These dies all have two sides. You see that little chamfer there? That's the side for the SAE inverted double flare. That side goes towards the turret for a double flare. The other side is used for the DIN bubble flare. Put your dies in the tool and then put your tube in the dies so that it is sticking out the front a little bit. Twist the clamp until it's just barely snug, and then you turn the turret to operation 0. Pull the lever until it stops. This will make sure your tube is at the right spot, flush with the front of the dies. Then clamp your tube down all the way. After that, just select operation 1 for the size and type of flare you're using and pull the lever. If you're making a bubble flare, you're done. If you're making the SAE inverted double flare, you need to turn the turret to operation 2 for the size of tubing that you're using and pull the lever again. Now you have a double flare. Crank open the clamp, remove the die, and there it is. Because of my weird setup, I had bubble flares at the master cylinder and rear brakes and double flares everywhere else, so I needed to keep track of what flare went where, but you might not have this problem. And my last line and my last cramp. I made it all the way without forgetting I put it on backward. Remember the old-fashioned way of bleeding brakes where your dad would tell you to press on the pedal and then he would undo the bleeder and then tighten it before you took your foot off the brake, but then you accidentally let go of the brake too early and it sucked air into the brake system and that's why your dad left? We're not going to do that. That's stupid. We're going to use speed bleeders. Speed bleeders are pretty great. They have this little spring and valve in them so you don't have to open and close the valve with a wrench every time. You just fill up your reservoir and pump your brakes. My local auto parts store had these for my rear calipers, but not my front. So for the front, I'm going to use a vacuum pump. This is, I think, actually better than the speed bleeder. Get a vacuum pump and run the vacuum line to your valve. Open the valve a little bit and it will just pull brake fluid from the reservoir through the system and to the caliper. When you see fluid, just close the valve. Just make sure you don't run out of fluid in the reservoir. Otherwise, you'll get air in the lines and then you'll have to pull it all the way through. When I do this, I wrap a little bit of Teflon tape around the bleeder valve near the top. This tape is not there to seal brake fluid, it's just there to make it less likely that we're going to be pulling air in through the threads. Cut a tiny strip, wrap it around near the top a couple of times, and screw it all the way in. Then back it out slightly. A faster way to do this is you get this thing that pressurizes the reservoir at the master cylinder, and then you attach one of these to each corner. I'm not going to do this because I don't have one of these. If you're bleeding a lot of brakes, this will come in handy. Otherwise, just get one of these cheap pumps. The drawback to these is that there are several different cap sizes. Pretty much all European cars use the same size because Europeans like to standardize things. Did this standard come from the Germans? I don't know, probably. These are great for race cars where you might need to change fluid frequently, or if you want to save time and just make it easier. You know what, I'm actually just going to buy one. Oh yeah, before you start bleeding, you'll want to go around and double check all of your fittings to make sure they're tight. That's it. Hop in your car and immediately drive as fast as possible. No, don't do that. First, you need to push your brakes as hard as you can. Hold it there for a few minutes and make sure that it doesn't move towards the floor. After that, get out, check all your unions, all your junctions, and all your valves to make sure none of them are leaking. After that, test it out by driving somewhere really slow, preferably where there are no people. Gradually increase your speed, making sure everything is working properly. You probably want to bleed the brakes again just a little bit, and then probably again a couple of weeks down the road. Any air bubbles in the system will make their way to the high points, which should be your valves and your master cylinder reservoir. And there you have it, brand new brake lines in 15 minutes. Amazing. It used to be that you had to impress people to get people to watch your show. Now you just have to impress the algorithm. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. All hail the algorithm.